We have two great presentations today. So one is we have Sakit Kesiraju and Avi Kunaduru, the co-founders of Augear, which is a product lab using AI to build commercial applications for the legal world. And we have Langston Nasholt and Rayan Krishnan, who are the winners of the best technical award that we gave out for our second Element Law Hackathon we ran recently, and they will present their Copilot Evaluator project. So yeah, we're excited to have you all here with us today. And yeah, without further ado, I'll turn it over to you. And you folks you other participants, if you have any questions or updates, please use the chat function. But I'll turn it over to Sakit.
Awesome. Thank you, Roland. Thanks for having us, Megan and Roland. I mean, it's an honor to present here. First, let me pull up our slides. Can everyone see our slides right now?
Yes, we can.
All right, perfect. So I'll give a quick introduction about myself. So I'm Sakit. I'm a student at NYU. I'm studying economics and computer science. I took a gap year to build in legal tech. And since sort of like building for the last 8 months, have realized that LLMs are going to be a very important part of the legal industry going forward. And Avi, you can give an intro yourself as well.
I can, yeah, so my name is Avi Kunaduru. I'm also one of the founders of Augear, and I've worked in the software space for about 4 years now, working at companies like Kensho Technologies and in startups as well.
Awesome. So yeah, I think really briefly to start off with. So the manner in which I want to give a little bit of some background on how I got into this space, because I think I've seen a lot of these CodeX presentations where essentially you're seeing a lot of attorneys, I've seen people in the legal space that have been attorneys for 10 to 20 years, working at Fenwick, working at DLA Piper, and so on. But my background is actually completely different, where I was actually a computer science student, and I was working in a completely different domain, and actually in fund formation, working with hedge fund managers. And essentially through learning the needs of some of these hedge fund guys, I found myself trying to build tooling for some of this fund formation, initial legal setup for funds. And I found myself sort of coming into this legal space through that dimension. So by coming in through the side door, through sort of like from the consumer standpoint, working with fund managers, I think that we have a much different sort of perspective on how legal services can be built using AI going forward. So that's basically what we want to unpack today, is sort of how we see LLMs playing a really crucial part in the legal industry and different sort of practices, as well as how to even sell to these lawyers. And in fact, that's going to be the first thing I want to talk about, is essentially how we've been able to sell to law firms, or even how to think about selling to law firms. And I think initially selling to law firms, even saying that term, a startup selling to law firms, is actually somewhat oxymoronic when you think about it. Because if you're trying to sell to DLA Piper or Baker McKenzie or any of these sort of really, really large law firms, and you're building, for example, these sort of contract-based tooling like redlining software or contract review, essentially you're building workspace software, which is essentially deeply, day-to-day task-driven tools for attorneys, except you're trying to go straight to the top organizations, the people at, chief innovation officers, and going to the procurement teams, essentially trying to pitch what's essentially a prototype or an MVP. And so these law firms, essentially, they only work with companies that have, customer service teams in place, service providers in place. And so the incentives are actually completely wrong for trying to approach, as a startup, an entire law firm. What really the incentives make sense for is for approaching individual attorneys, and essentially is to focus on the incentives of attorneys. And so sort of the analogy that I make is that, like, if you're a software company, if you're building, like, think about the sort of the attorney tooling in the day-to-day basis, like an IDE for a software engineer, where if you're building Replit, if you're building, repo tooling like GitHub, and you want to sell that to a really, really large tech company, you aren't going to start by basically getting a meeting with, the top, SaaS procurement guy at the firm and trying to sell them on software that nobody even knows anyone at their team likes. And so you have to start with a very grassroots based sort of manner, where you're essentially, speaking to attorneys at these firms, having attorneys use your products. And essentially the easier incentive to basically, I think, get people to use your products is to not sell to firms, but sell to attorneys, and essentially find specific functions that attorneys have and just build tools for those specific attorneys. Because organizations at the end of the day are made of individuals. So sell to those individuals first before even think about selling to quote unquote law firms. And so that's some of sort of an insight that we had by talking to. So there's a raised hand. Should I ignore that, or can I keep going?
No, if you're willing to take a question. Lena, do you have a question? Yeah, maybe you can. Well, let's hold the question for later until.
All right, sounds good.
And you have about, I would say, like a total of like 10, 15 minutes, and then you want to leave enough time for questions from folks. And then at 2, we'll turn it over to Langston and Rayan.
100%. Yeah, we'll.
All right.
Get so
perfect.
Anyway, back to some of these incentives. So this is sort of a few questions that we've talked to maybe 50 to 100 lawyers at sort of large law firms, solo practitioner firms, 3 to 5 person small firms. And essentially talking to attorneys, you get a real sort of understanding of how they perceive software. And I think there was a funny sort of like anecdote a couple of weeks ago at the hackathon where someone mentioned that a senior partner at a big law firm was essentially given $100,000 bonus to use a computer, because essentially that is sort of the attitude towards technology at these really, really large firms. And so it's sort of better to sort of think about the incentives of attorneys. And we're thinking about, when you're asking these questions, like, do you think about thinking about software? Do you think about software enabling you to do your job better? When you've been doing your job well for the last 10, 15 years, do you really believe that there's software, there's tooling that's going to make you exponentially better at the thing that you've been doing for the last 10 to 20 years? So that's a hard argument to make. But what is something that every attorney thinks about is how to drive more clients to their practice, to their partner's practice. And essentially driving more clients is, on the consumer basis, much easier to validate, and is a sort of a methodology that we've used to sort of have attorneys engage with us and use our products. So what we did for Fund Formation, if I can get to that, essentially, give me a sec. So was essentially look at the paperwork automations that need to be done. So LLMs are great because you can essentially parse through documents, you can insert sort of text in documents, you can use LLMs to review the insertions made by LLMs. You can essentially automate a lot of the client intake process. So when you're looking at a lot of these template-based sort of like practices, you can see that LLMs can actually automate a lot of this initial just, hourly workflows. That's anywhere from like 5 to 25 hours for doing some of your document sort of insertions and doing a lot of your document-based just workflows. And so using LLMs was what we essentially thought of as the solution for Fund Formation. And this is just an assortment of different template-based practices that we could go into with the product that we built. But essentially what we did for Fund Formation, I can give a quick demo, is basically we built a tool that essentially, if I can go here, everyone can see the screen. So we built a tool here that essentially enables any attorney to basically drop in a template. And essentially what our tool does is go through the blanks in that template, essentially tag them as questions that need to be asked. And then based on the context around the blank, it asks really pointed specific questions for how a client should answer that essentially specific field. And so what we've done is take sort of, for Fund Formation at least, these really large documents that your limited partnership agreement, your PPM agreement, and basically abstract that into a much smaller document with our partner at DLA Piper. And this is now a 20-page document that is then abstracted into a form that now all a client or an emerging fund manager has to do is answer these set of questions. And so, what our software does is you answer these set of questions, and essentially it inserts the answers back into the template in the specific format that it's in. And then when you submit, it submits all those answers essentially. So if you can see here, all the insertions are in the right specific spot. Sorry if I'm going a little bit quickly. We have a little bit to get through. And so essentially this is like a template automation tool that in theory can be used for as many template workflows as we can find an attorney to provide templates for. If that makes sense. So this is an automation for essentially your client intake, for reviewing the information through client intake, for inserting the answers back into those templates. And so that as a process alone is hyper sort of ubiquitous across different practices. And so that's the first tool we built. And so we have an attorney for Fund Formation and are looking for sort of different niches within different practice areas where we can implement this tool. And so that's sort of this Fund Formation template-based tool that we built out. And sort of the second focus that we've been thinking about is how we sort of use LLMs for decision making or for judgment-based practices. That's like your arbitration or your litigation-based practices, because the great thing about LLMs is that it's just about large-scale extraction of sort of structured text or unstructured text in documents. And so when you're able to sort of use the computational power of LLMs to basically automate, finding similarity or finding, case-by-case analysis, you can then use that as basically like a basis to do more abstract secondary order things like creating prediction engines or creating sort of like specific factor-based outcomes, like, oh, if the judge, if a specific judge tried this case, what's an outcome that this judge would, try a different case in that manner, or if like time of day is also a very big factor in terms of these litigation cases. And so there's a bunch of different sort of like high level LLM enabled practice, like judgment practice based tooling that can happen. And so what we did is essentially look at on the median or at the mean what sort of the infrastructure for an application like that would look like. And basically what we came up with is basically having a niche data set for a specific practice. So you can choose like family law, securities law, employment law, etc. And essentially having that case data into like an embeddings or like a vector store, essentially, that allows you to do, case to case, basically analysis to figure out if cases are similar to precedent cases. And then off of that similarity, you can basically create a second order prediction on sort of like outcomes of specific sort of cases. So that's like win or lose, and then settlement estimates in terms of dollar value. And so really quickly, I'll just go through our demo for litigation prediction. And right here, if you guys can see this. So this is the basic view. You can essentially go through the flow of sort of going through, specific situation that you've been in. So I can do construction and negligence, for example, and I have like a case I put here, which is basically, you can read it really quickly, but it's basically a homeowner that hires a construction company, and the construction company hires a contractor, and essentially there's just unsafe working practices on the construction site going on. And so I'll hit submit. It normally takes a minute or two for it to load, but if I can essentially take it to the answer real quick to show you guys what it looks like. You guys can go right now to litigationprediction.com and try yourselves. But what it shows is essentially these 10 similar cases on the left-hand side. And then based off of the situation I provided, basically gives you some logic in terms of saying, there wasn't no safety harnesses. They think that John, who's the plaintiff, will probably succeed in the case. And then based off of these precedent cases, which I can click through and read, it's a little bit, it's still an MVP, and so the UX can be improved, but I'm sorry. Essentially, you see all the similar cases, and these cases essentially are then used to basically provide these second order sort of outcomes. And so that's basically the LLM or the judgment-based sort of, that's essentially the judgment-based tooling product that we built out. And how we sort of see this like sort of going forward is how a lot of these LLM tools are currently being used exactly as sort of like these granular optimization tools. But I think that sort of going forward, the way that different advisories or professions like lawyers, tax advisors, financial advisors, et cetera, can essentially just be enabled by entire sort of databases that are essentially LLM. So there's essentially, you can go out and aggregate as much case data as possible that you can validate to be to have citations for, and essentially create these almost like APIs or data sets of vetted information that can be used to either enhance an enterprise's sort of internal tooling and data enablement for how they make decisions, for how they evaluate risk for new cases. And secondarily, it could be also used for direct access to justice in terms of chatbots and other things like that on a consumer side. So that's sort of like a large view on how we see these LLMs transforming legal space. And how we're going to market really quickly is just through starting with entity formation, because that's something that already essentially people are doing. We start with fund formation, and then also for SaaS in terms of some of these prediction tools being implemented in-house, as well as a combination of the two. So this is some of our traction. This is what we've been doing at fund formation, working with an attorney at DLA Piper. And then these are sort of some of these consumer-based, sort of focused legal and template adjacent sort of like service legal tech startups that we see as sort of like relevant or adjacent competitors. Then this is our partner, Adam Tope. Fund Launch is the distribution partner, which is how we're getting all of our emerging fund managers to use our software. And so there's sort of like a YC for emerging fund managers. And this is just our team, me, Avi, Swapnil, it's just the four of us. And then Kanan is just a friend of mine that sort of has been in the business for a while. So I know I definitely, unloaded a lot of information and there's gonna be a lot of questions.
Yeah, from the fire hose. Thank you so much. This is exciting and very interesting. I think it will be a good conversation now. But I saw a couple of hands up already. Now it's only Shugam. Shugam, you want to ask your question, and maybe I have to ask you to unmute here. Can you unmute yourself?
Hi, Saket. This is Sugam Sharma. I'm the founder of Illegals. I run almost a similar business, prediction and prior similar cases. I have a few questions. So did you train this LLM on prior cases or just use pre-trained model?
So we had to train it on prior cases. So I'll say essentially that we built it at Stanford's at CodeX's hackathon a couple of weekends back. And essentially we built it as a non-commercial tool, basically as an MVP. We basically used non-commercially downloaded Westlaw cases to basically train this model. But it was essentially just to test out whether this architecture worked in terms of using niche data sets to basically extrapolate future outcomes.
Yeah, so this is for a specific course, or it works for lower and higher courts both?
It basically depends on what case law you provided. So there's different factors you can prompt it. So if you want to focus on sort of a specific district court or a specific even like geographic region, essentially it just depends on what data you're feeding the model itself.
And so where do you get the data for lower courts, if in case you need to use it?
So I think you can check out case law and free law. Those are things that you can probably access without sort of permission explicitly. But I think that in reality, to access some of this data, you have to have some relationships or bespoke partnerships with, for example, in healthcare, like malpractice, for example, we have to talk to insurance companies that basically have all this data on their small claims. And essentially, if our pitch to them is that if we can have access to your data, we can essentially create a sort of like risk engine for how we can how you guys can even evaluate risk and settlements and claims.
Thank you.
If that's an example, right.
Yeah. Lena, do you still have a question?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks for your presentation. It was super cool to see what you were working on. I'm actually also on leave from Stanford to co-found a startup, Lightbulb, where I'm trying to automate patent applications. And so a lot of your presentation had a lot of useful information. Going back to your distribution in the beginning, when you were talking about selling to lawyers instead of law firms, we've actually been working with a law firm and lawyers. And I think a lot of the problems that we face when we're trying to sell to lawyers directly is there's just a lot of confidentiality and sandboxing around like data or information that they're able to provide. That made it difficult to work with lawyers individually and really provide value outside of sort of the protected environment that their law firm would allow. And I was wondering if you've thought about that or how you've worked around that to really get value out of those lawyer-to-lawyer relationships. Yeah,
so I would say that in the manner, at least that we went about it, or I think I was maybe lucky in terms of how we got our DLA Piper sort of attorney, which was basically through me building and essentially taking calls over a 6-month period of iterating. And it was basically just I think we were able to maybe get past some of that initial maybe like trust issues in terms of like he was able to provide me templates, he was able to give me things where it wasn't necessarily, I would say, like as rigid. But even in terms of other attorneys, I would say that the process is more about talking to attorneys in terms of even you getting validation for whether your product is something people want. I'd say like as like taking a step back, I'd say that the matter in terms of like talking to attorneys is really so that if you talk to enough attorneys at a firm and essentially they've used it a few times, you've built out maybe an MVP, something that they can deploy locally on-prem, that they can deploy where all of the data is essentially obfuscated, or the sensitive data is obfuscated, and then you can basically say that, okay, everything that runs through your session basically deletes within an hour. And basically you can make these certain compromises where people will be willing to try out your work if you are like building things for them. But essentially, like more than that, it's more about the idea validation process, is more about talking to these attorneys and basically trying to get your own almost like mafia of attorneys internally in the firm. So when you actually do go to the procurement process, they're just attorneys already inside the firm that are like basically pushing you forward internally. And so like that's a big sort of a point, which is that most of these procurement processes, yes, they go through a lot of like competition checks, they like review other products as well, but a lot of it is also who inside the firm has used them and know these guys. And if like there's a lot of attorneys at that firm that can vouch for you, then that's a higher chance of you guys going through procurement and getting like a large scale service provider contract. So I'd say it's just that like this is just step 1, and step 10 is essentially getting the law firm to give you like a big contract.
Yeah, and I don't want to take up too much time here. So just one follow-up question. So yeah, I totally hear what you're saying in terms of like idea validation. I think during that stage, my co-founder and I were also talking to a lot of lawyers individually. And maybe if you see this as a difference in like patent law versus the value that you're providing with templates, let me know. But I think when it came to like not just them trying out our product and be like, oh yeah, this is cool, but when it came to actually providing value to their workflows, it was hard to do that outside of, like an actual NDA being signed. So there was just a lot more friction there. Do you think that you were able to provide value to them?
So I would say
in a way, yeah.
No, I understand your question. So I would say, right, so I'd say the main point in selling to these lawyers, right, and the point that basically you brought up is that there's no urgency for anyone to act. Like tools can be great and tools can be useful and tools can be efficient, but there's no urgency for an attorney to now like tomorrow say, hey, I want to use this, and there's no real urgency for many attorneys at this point, or even many people who are even like using software. And so the hack for that was basically why we went the consumer side first. And basically, so what we did for fund formation is basically partnered with a third party sort of like fund community that was basically giving us a bunch of leads. So they're basically giving us volume of fund managers that needed formations done. And we were basically going to different attorneys and saying, hey, we basically have 200 fund managers at like $5,000 per formation, if you guys can do that, and we'll give you all of this basically like new client load for using this product. And so it was basically selling the leads, and the software was like the vehicle for them to actually execute on the thing they wanted, which was just new clients. So that's what I like sort of mentioned earlier, which was that like essentially the top incentive is just them making more money. And so you should just build products that essentially make them more money. And like validating the software is a much harder thing for people that don't even sort of identify software as something that is a value add like intrinsically. Like it's hard to get lawyers to even perceive software as something that is important to their workflows.
Yeah, that's a great point you're raising there, Sakit. That's so true. Sometimes you go in with an assumption that just making workflows more efficient and streamlining stuff will be resonating with your prospective customer, but that's many times is a very difficult pitch, and being in a situation or in a particular kind of context, as you described, where you were able to offer a bunch of new client relationships that they can process more effectively with your software, is a very nice way to get the foot in the door. So I don't know if there are many other areas in the law that have a similar kind of constellation, but it's a really good point.
Exactly. That's why I wouldn't even describe us as like a startup yet, right? Like in some ways we just did a trade. Like I validated that we can do trades with law firms in some ways, where I can do clients and they're able to use software to execute on those clients. And so something that I think we still need to validate is how many other practices or how many other sort of like niches can we productize all together, and essentially get sort of like lead gen for, and then create a whole new sort of like service almost on the internet for these specific practices. And I think that's something that we're trying to validate in the long term. And so it's like, I think even like an ask that I would have is basically, if there are specific attorneys or specific people that even anyone at CodeX knows that essentially does a niche thing very, very specifically, like, well, it's like, oh, there's a person that's known for doing like Cayman Islands, entity creations, or someone that's known for doing, I guess, like specific personal injury relating to car crashes, or these very, very niche sort of like practice sort of like practices, I guess. are really the place where you can sort of try to productize value as much as possible, and then sort of have people give into those short-term incentives, at least on the attorney side, of just having clients in the short term.
Cool. Awesome. So Aaron's asking a couple of questions. So number one, what sources of data are you considering for your litigation predictive tool? And yeah, I think you talked about that already. Could you please preview how the workflow aspect of the LLM fund formation platform works? Yeah.
Yeah,
I can answer that.
Yeah, you can.
Yeah, so basically how it works is the attorney will first provide the actual document that they want to automate in a sense. So basically they'll give us a term sheet. Our kind of AI platform will then go and then figure out what all the insertion points for questions are. So it'll look at what blank spaces are in the document. It'll look at places where the client will need to put in any questions, and then it'll basically figure out, okay, where are those insertion points, and from there it'll basically figure those out. Then we'll provide a link that the attorney can provide to their client, which will provide that client view, which is what you saw in the demo, where the client will basically open that link. They'll be able to see the document with all of the insertion points and where they need to go, and then a form to a side where they can actually just fill out a series of questions to basically fill out that document. One part of the actual demo we weren't able to show off is we also have a LLM chat involved as well. So if you have any questions on the actual document itself, you can ask the chatbot that we provided, and then it can basically give you any kind of helpful advice on anything that you're stuck on.
Yeah, I think in terms of a demo, we can maybe you can contact us sort of outside, and we can do a longer form thing, if that makes sense.
Sure. No, that sounds great. And thanks for the fuller explanation. Just a couple of follow-up questions. So with respect to the workflow, does the workflow basically start and stop at the document that is being generated with the help of the LLM? So you don't go on to other aspects of the transaction that would sort of bring in input from other departments at the law firm, or help you generate other documents relating to the fund formation. What's your approach on that?
So it's basically an attorney in the loop on one side of the software, and the other side of the interface is basically a client. And so basically, I think the easiest way to explain this is just a digital interface between your attorney and you. And basically, all the documents that you'd probably have to file over or get over PDF via email is just you're getting a digital sort of form that you're answering instead. And so basically you still have your attorney basically in the loop. You're just communicating with him, and he's providing documents for you to sign, and you can sort of chat with him all throughout this interface. So I'll just say that high level, that's basically what it is. So you can get new documents. You can essentially, if you need to create a new entity, if you need to sort of restructure how your asset protection works, essentially all of those things can basically happen through that dashboard.
Yeah. Okay. And so just as a clarifying question, so you're not using the LLM to generate the actual document, you're using it to basically customize an existing template and populate it.
Exactly.
Which is probably a safer, more controlled environment, right? That has immediate, sometimes, there's some use cases where then people try to generate the entire document with the LLM, and that introduces sometimes issues, right? And so, okay, so that's cool. All right, so then
sorry, Roland, if I could just jump in with a related question on the data side for the litigation prediction. So have you thought about, and how do you address issues like bias when you're allowing, I guess in two respects. One, if you're allowing the user to select the universe of data that you're using for generating your predictions, rather than basing it off of something that's been reviewed and considered for purposes of statistical representativeness. And second, I guess, what are you doing to ensure, because one of the challenges, sorry, they're practicing for the air shows over our house. One of the delights of this time of year in the East Bay. One of the challenges that I've run into before with respect to predictive analytics in the litigation space is you get a lot of very unevenly distributed results in terms of public availability of settlement. So, even if you're thinking about things like litigation outcome, because it shouldn't matter ultimately whether the litigation outcome is a result of a judgment or a settlement, right? I mean, you should be thinking just generally what my expected outcome should be. But, depending on the jurisdiction and depending on, the situations of the parties, you get incredibly uneven distributions of data as to litigation outcomes. And so that I think has been a historical challenge with respect to what you actually use for purposes of sort of coming up with some kind of reasonable comfort in the accuracy of your prediction.
Yeah. So I think really briefly on the first question. So you
have to be kind of concise with your answer, please, because we're already at 2 minutes after 2. So we have to.
We aren't scouring the internet for data. We're essentially used a private case database that we can actually use commercially. And so the way that we actually implement this is essentially just taking this infrastructure to a specific law firm or to a specific health insurance company or to specific data providers, and then basically making the pitch to them that's saying essentially this is how well this architecture works for sort of extrapolating future outcomes. And basically we have sort of like partners right now, but that's the challenge essentially in acquiring these like data providers that essentially do give you this metadata. So it's something that we're looking at more insularly.
Cool. All right, Sakit, and there's a couple of other questions from folks in the chat. So if you could answer them in the chat, that would be great, and perhaps also put your contact information there so that people, if they have follow-on questions,
100%,
they can reach out to you. And Sakit and Avi, thank you so much for sharing with us. It's really fascinating what you guys are up to. It's very cool. So
thank you, Roland.
Really appreciate it.
Of course.
And yeah, it's great to have you. And all right, well, over to Langston and Rayan.
Yeah, hi guys. So we're Playground RL. This is a project that spun out of the most recent CodeX for Law hackathon. And the headline is, we are trying to create evaluation metrics for many of these legal LLM applications. A little bit of background about ourselves.
Langston, are you sharing a deck, or are you sharing slides?
Can you? Oops. Sorry.
Maybe I just don't see them, but.
Can other people not see our slides as well?
No, we can see them.
Visible.
Oh, okay. Sorry. It's just
we can all see it.
Lost somewhere.
Okay, perfect.
Different screens here. My apologies. All right, I'll find them.
Yeah, no worries. We'll just continue. So yeah, we met actually before Stanford on a pre-orientation backpacking trip, and we both just recently graduated undergrad, focusing on computer science and machine learning. And we've both taken time off of our masters to pursue exploring evaluations and expert use cases, specifically legal. It seems that LLMs will have an outsized impact on the legal industry. According to a recent survey done by LexisNexis, 56% of large firms believe AI will have a large impact on law. Furthermore, 51% of lawyers at large firms have already used AI in some capacity. As those of you who've gone through law school know, law requires a tremendous amount of text being written and read. So it makes it a really viable use case for AI because there's so much data. Furthermore, if LLMs are able to drive efficiency in common workflows, This will allow large law firms to be able to produce more work with less billable hours, able to outcompete their competition. And indeed, we've seen a huge proliferation of new, exciting legal tech projects and startups. These include use cases like copilots, systems that you can ask legal questions to and will give you an answer in a chat-based format. However, we've also seen use cases in things like e-discovery. For example, many e-discovery platforms are using AI to summarize large corpuses of documents, streamlining the e-discovery process. We've also seen innovation in billable hours tracking. And finally, in contracts, like we just saw, either generating or filling contracts and streamlining that work process. So we can clearly see that the legal industry will be likely changed by LLMs.
Although it's really exciting to see all of these applications, it seems like there's a core problem that's shared by them all. It's still incredibly challenging to ensure that these general purpose foundation models are both safe and accurate on these specialized legal tasks. In practice, this materializes in the form of a considerable chasm between the engineers and the domain experts. When engineers make changes to the models, they evaluate by spot checking a few sample outputs in which they know the answer. However, these tests are not representative, and the engineers do not have the domain expertise to give a comprehensive form of evaluation. On the other end of the spectrum, groups can hire consultants or use their in-house experts to run a more comprehensive evaluation to collect annotations and in this form of human feedback. However, these experts can cost anywhere between $50 and $2,000 per hour and can present a severe time bottleneck for engineering teams. And this is where our solution comes into play. Our intention is to leverage both of these groups to provide an alternative. At its core, we're building a unit test framework that approximates expert evaluation. So how this works is our Playground RL system sits as an intermediary between the machine learning engineers and the experts on the other side. The in-house experts and contractors first define a set of tests and the criteria they would use to evaluate the outputs. Then machine learning engineers can make changes to the model, such as the backbone or fine-tuning on new data sets or doing prompt engineering. As they make these changes, they can submit the latest model for evaluation to our system. Then, using the tests and the criteria, we provide a model performance summary that describes what went wrong in the latest version of the model. It's important to note that through this process, we're not completely replacing the in-house experts, but instead we're trying to augment them so that their time is used in the most valuable way possible. With this system of codified unit tests, the engineers can actually run much more quickly and more frequently a set of tests to determine how well the model is performing. Our system works overall by using conventional string matching with classical machine learning for confidence prediction. And in conjunction, we use a large language model for generating free text explanations. The underlying thesis behind our platform is supported by two trends that we're observing in the literature. First, it's that these foundation models are actually better at classification than the primordial task of generation. We've highlighted this DARA paper here, which is a version of this in healthcare, in which a model is tasked with deciding whether the output matches the reference corpus, and this is used in conjunction with a generation model. The second is a trend away in evaluation metrics from n-gram approaches towards using more complex language models for evaluation. Papers like this BERT score is illustrative of this trend. Okay, now we'll take a second to show a demo of the system. So one of the core concepts within our platform is the notion of a test suite. A test suite is a collection of checks that we run against our model. And here we can show what it looks like to create a new test suite. We can just say that this is a demo test suite that we can populate. Right now it's empty. And then we can show what it looked like to add a test. So say we were developing an immigration law chatbot. We want to be able to be prepared for a set of inputs that a user might provide. And a sample question someone may give is, what do I need for a green card? So we can write this as a sample input and define a set of checks that we'd like to run on the output. So hitting the plus, we would add an operator and a criteria. We can just start with the includes operator and say that we would like to include some mention of the Immigration and Nationality Act. This is some kind of precedent that we want to make sure that we cite in our answer. Next, we can add some kind of exclusion maybe something like, you will become a US citizen, because actually this is an application for a green card. We should not give any indication about claims for US citizenship. And then we can add some kind of unary operator like is concise, and that would just determine whether the output is producing any redundant information or it's as concise as possible. We've also written another test called is legal. We can just add to this as well, which determines whether the output is generally abiding by our legal definition. Okay, now we can hit save, and that latest test should be populated within our test suite. Now we can trigger a run to occur for that test suite we just created. Okay, and we can see here on the run page that it's currently in progress. While it runs, we can look at a previous run that we issued. This is for the Open SARA tax data set. So this would be some sample questions that a tax co-pilot might receive. And on the first column, you can see that we have, again, the test input, but now the second column is the latest LLM output for that input. And the checks that we had previously defined as operators and criteria are now shown in the subsequent columns. Then to the right of the criteria, we have the auto eval and auto feedback, which forms the crux of our evaluation platform. This is a quantitative output that indicates 0 or 1 as to whether or not the test passed or failed, and then produces a free text explanation for why it is that the model actually failed or passed this check. And we find that this kind of thing is very useful if the LLM output is super long. Debugging why a model made a mistake or produced a valid answer can take a bit of time. So this provides a much faster way. And then we provide a grouped error rate, which compiles the pass rate across individual checks of a question. We also have the functionality to add additional human annotation. So hitting the edit button, we can now see the prompt and the output, and in-house experts, and when they have time, can add additional numeric evaluation and handwritten feedback. This sort of thing can help with the feedback loop, so the system more closely approximates the kind of feedback they would give. And then finally, we're able to compile all this information, and we run a series of error case groupings and produce a final summary that describes what went wrong in the model, and there's some key trends in the model performance. This should provide the most actionable way to interpret the results. Okay, I think we can just check back to see whether our run completed. Looks like it did, and it passed 75% of the tests. Okay, in conjunction with this UI web interface, we're also developing a CLI tool. Actually, we don't have to show that for the sake of this demo, but if there's time, maybe we can come back to it. Essentially, this CLI tool allows developers to define a set of tests in JSON and then immediately import them into our system and execute runs from their command line. Okay, hopefully this gives a sense of what the platform looks like and how it might be useful for evaluation. Yeah, let's just shift to the next slide. So this brings us to our current work. We're continuing to develop this platform out of the hackathon and make it more useful to people in practice. And to that end, we're collaborating with a couple of groups in industry to build this evaluator tool to their particular use case. We're also currently integrating some open source models into the pipeline, and we're also exploring ways to generate new test inputs from the ones already provided.
Yeah, thank you so much for listening to us. If any of what we've talked about sounds interesting, please reach out over email to either lnashville@stanford.edu or ryank@stanford.edu. Especially consider reaching out if you're interested in using this evaluation tool for your own products, or if you're a legal professional interested in collaborating with us as we integrate human feedback into the platform. We'll open it up to questions now.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Also very interesting, and I'm wondering, if you can sort of explain your sort of the initial use case that you had in mind and some of the new use cases that you're planning to work on with your industry partners already now.
Yeah, so the initial use case we saw was for chatbots. So we have some kind of more well-defined sensitive types of questions that people might try and ask. And so we can make that very systematized and just execute them as a set of unit tests for types of questions we would expect. And so actually one of the groups we're working with is building a tax co-pilot, which is why we selected that open data set to test. What we're looking more to apply our system for in the future is documents, because the legal industry just has such a large collection of existing documents and also constitutes like creating new documents from scratch. We're trying to see if there are ways in which we can integrate the evaluation system for PDFs and more conventional documents.
Got it. Cool. Lena has another question.
Yeah, awesome presentation, you guys. I had a good question about the incentive structures that are present. So I guess there are two levels. One is, what is the incentive for the experts that would help you build like the test suite criteria for them to help you build that? And then the second is, like, as you are growing, like, how do you view the incentives of the companies that you're running evaluations from to continue to pay you to do it rather than to build up their own in-house evaluations? Where, like, from their perspective, perhaps it's something like, you know, like, we have experts that we've collaborated with, why would we outsource that to you?
Yeah, I can start it and then you can add anything. I think this is something that we're still exploring, and right now we're primarily concerned with providing the best evaluation tool we can. But in terms of making sure incentives are aligned, we're actually not taking on any of the burden of writing any of the tests ourselves. So this is just a infrastructure tool by which groups can use their in-house lawyers and define the test themselves. And in that way, all the data collected or used in the evaluation system is closed off to within individual groups that we're partnering with. There's no like crossover between tests that we define being used across multiple partners. And then in terms of why people would want to use our tool instead of others they would build in-house, I think right now it takes a lot of engineering work to try and build all of these things in-house. And so if people can use this immediately, we're finding is that there's interest in trying it out, even though it's still kind of in this rough state that we showed to all of you. But then in the future, as we make it more rigorous, the goal is that we continually show additional value compared to something that you would want to build in-house.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, as a small startup or like research group, your resources are really limited. So you want to spend your time doing things that will differentiate you from the competition. So if what your needs are is an evaluation platform, but that's not like what differentiates you, then in my opinion, it makes much more sense to use something that's already built, because like creating a tool creates a lot of engineering effort, which could be spent on your product. And with regard to the first point, yeah, there's kind of two scenarios in which you could imagine this. You either have the experts on the client side, or you have the experts on our side. And so right now, the initial use case we're thinking about is actually having the experts on the user side. So they would leverage people who they're already collaborating with, and our tool essentially like would streamline that process. However, in the future, if you're thinking about also having expertise like on our side through collaboration, then you could imagine some sort of setup in which, like, for example, if a very small startup doesn't have like an in-house legal team yet, they could leverage people we work with, you know, for some sort of monetary fee, which we would then pass along to the people who are actually like providing their expertise. But
so
that's more sort of theoretical.
You're building a database of, you know, of questions and correct answers to those questions in a way for that you might be able to use in the initial case for an immigration chatbot, but then it might also be relevant for other areas of legal chatbots or legal documents. And that new entity might not need to bring in its own legal experts to help you calibrate the tool, but you could help basically give them a template in a sense.
That's a good point, but actually, a lot of these like evaluation metrics are somewhat like client specific. So
Right.
we would have to be careful about what we like share between clients, because you know, if one legal co-pilot group is creating their like evaluation suite, that's not something that we would necessarily want to share with like a second group who's like a competitor.
Makes sense. Howard has his hand up. I see.
Hey, so I just have two quick questions. Should lawyers pay attention to the BERT score, and what is your average BERT score?
I think BERT score is an improvement on something like Blue score, which uses conventional n-grams, or Rouge, which is probably a previous paradigm that would be most established. Something like BERT score captures semantic equivalency, which I think is a step in the right direction, but I don't think it's perfect in all situations. I mean, namely, if you don't have a right answer, it's really hard to determine whether outputs generated are good or bad. And in those cases, what you actually want to do is define more rigorous criteria or constitutional approaches for how to evaluate outputs. And then the second question was, what average BERT score do we see? So we're not actually developing a Copilot tool or a legal application. We're just trying to do the evaluation structure. So, I mean, we have BERT scores of people that we're partnering with, but that's just restricted to their use case.
Cool.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Any other questions? So what's your plan for? I mean, I think you outlined it already. So you wanna work with some industry partners at this point to see if your kind of tool is useful, or see what kind of different areas it can be deployed. Are you sort of already are you incorporated and you're looking for funding, or you're still this is still early stage and pre-incorporation?
But right now, our primary goal is just to really provide a strong evaluation tool for people building legal tools. And so we're working with these design partners to really understand the requirements that they have in a tool like this and make our system more complete. And that's just our main goal for the next month or so. It's hard to predict any point forward from there. I think just as an example, one of the groups that we are working with, they communicated to us how it's really important to make sure that outputs generated are not giving explicit legal advice, but instead they're caveated and say something along the lines of, we always recommend you consult external legal counsel before making any decisions. And that way they're kind of de-risked before shipping. And so that actually seems like a criterion that's shared across many different chatbot tools. And by unlocking that insight, we can codify that one test that can be used across all of the partners. And so that kind of thing, where if we have more iteration with people at the forefront of using this technology, then we can learn much more quickly the types of tools that they want to see and integrate that within the platform.
Got it. Okay, so I missed the question that Jason had, which is, have you considered generating criteria from specific examples rather than, or in addition to, in the abstract?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we definitely think that like being able to like automatically generate some of these criteria rather than like manually defining each one is like a huge value add. Because currently like that is where a decent amount of the work comes in. Yeah, I think there's a couple of approaches. For example, if you have something that's like live already, you can do some sort of extractive approach where you take like common questions real users have asked, and then you codify those into tests. But there's also other things you can do as well.
Yeah, I don't know if I understand the question completely, but also just on the other end of the spectrum, we have these abstractly defined criterion. So in the example, we showed something about checking whether the output excluded information about being a US citizen. So this isn't just manually going through the output and seeing whether US citizen is contained or not contained in the output, but we're just more generally seeing whether or not the output has some semantic encoding of the concept of US citizenship, and it's touching on this in the output. But we also have the ability to do that more conventional string meshing approach, and that's another operator which we didn't show in this demo.
Yeah, does that answer the question?
Kind of. What I'm imagining is you have the experts and they need to say things like, it didn't include a caveat that this isn't legal advice and you should talk to a lawyer, and they have to kind of formalize that as a set of criteria. I'm wondering if you've considered a different workflow for the experts, that involves specific questions and specific answers, and where they say, I do like this answer because blah, I don't like this answer because blah, and then you extract the criteria from blah. Is that something that you've looked at?
I see. Yeah, it's not something we've implemented yet, but it's definitely something that we've considered, because the value add in terms of user experience is definitely there.
Thanks very much.
I'll just add that. Yeah, right now we had that system we showed where you can put a dialog box of feedback and a numeric score. And so our plan is to take that a step further and do something very similar to what you described, of like reverse engineer a constitution and then use that constitution to approximate the feedback, and use the numeric scoring to adjust how our quantitative system gives evaluation. So that
makes perfect sense. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, guys. Great talk.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so Katie's asking, many folks want to figure out how to judge LLM performance against precision and recall, the F1 scores for fine-tuned models. That's the money question, as it were. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think precision recall and these sorts of things are really strong approaches for conventional like classification tasks, but they're very tricky for a setting like this, which is natural language generation. And then once you produce generation, like I think there needs to be sub-metrics for which we can define precision, recall, accuracy, things like this. And so our thought process is that we can discretize the NLG evaluations to different dimensions. And potentially one dimension of that is factual accuracy. And so if we have factual accuracy as one of them, then the kind of outputs we would be verifying against would determine what percentage of the tests run produce factually accurate answers. And yeah, so I think, I guess, producing a system like that is our intention, but we believe we need to split this up into things like accuracy, stylistic fluency, grammar. And once we have to rigorously define those to the form of these tests, we can produce a numeric answer in the form of precision and recall.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, great. So Katie likes it. I take it. So good. This is so we're pretty much at the end of our time. And yeah, if you could also put your contact info into the chat so people can reach you, that would be great. I want to thank you for a great presentation, and for participating in the hackathon. And Saket and Avi also participated in our LLM hackathon. And I feel like we'll hear a lot more from the four of you in the coming months and years in this legal innovation space. And thank you so much for sharing with our group today. And yeah, this is all really interesting and exciting work that you're working on. So on behalf of everyone, I give you a sort of a round of applause. And yes, we will be convening again. Megan, what are we meeting next week again, or?
No, it's going to be the week after.
2 weeks after. Okay, so we won't be meeting again in 2 weeks. So stay tuned. We'll send out an email, and nice to have you all join us for this session. Again, thank you to our speakers, and yeah, see you all soon. Bye-bye.